Welcome everybody this morning. We're going to be speaking on Romans chapter 4 this morning. We're going to try to get through the whole chapter. So there's a familiar story in chapter 4, but we're going to look at it as kind of a different, not a different direction, but just as far as the story is concerned. We're going to be talking about faith this morning. And I want us all to remember who Paul is writing to and what's going on in the Church of Rome with the influx of the Jewish brethren coming back and I don't know that it's turmoil, if you'd call it turmoil, but the issues that they're having with that particular situation. And Paul talks about and discusses and focuses on faith, not as far as a definition of faith, but just story of faith. And the story he uses is Abraham. And so we're going to talk about Abraham this morning and about what is faith according to Abraham's story. Not just what we or his readers know about what the word means, but we get to see it in action in Abraham's story. Now, it doesn't seem odd that Paul would be talking about Abraham, because Paul's a Jew. What struck me as odd at first, before I got through the lesson, was back to where we started, who he's talking to. What significance would Abraham have with the Gentile brethren in Rome? And that's what we're going to talk about, those particulars this morning, on how we see faith, how we understand faith, and how we define faith through Abraham's story, Abraham's example, and Abraham's life. So knowing the meaning of the word is obviously important. Faith is, when you break it down, is our trust in God. The faith that we're talking about in the scriptures this morning is our faith, is our trust in God. But we need to remember that it's an active faith. Okay? Abraham had an active faith. So our faith should not only acknowledge God. We can see through Abraham that his faith acknowledged God, but also drives us to act in a way that shows our faith, acknowledges our faith, and ultimately strengthens our faith. And so it's dynamic. The faith that we're speaking of this morning is a dynamic thing. It's a growing thing. It's an active thing. It defines the way we walk and the way we talk and think and live. And what Paul speaks about is Abraham's role, and it wasn't something that I considered before I started this study, but Abraham's role in our salvation. Okay, and we'll get to that. His faith brought him close to God, and our emulance, how we emulate his faith, should bring us closer to God. And so, for Abraham, it wasn't things like the law or circumcision, things that we can understand that the Jewish mindset would be set towards. as Paul's speaking of Abraham, the covenant with the circumcision and the law and his meritorious deeds, all the good. But his faith is what brought forgiveness. His faith is what gave him hope in God's promise. And his faith grounded him, connected him, put him in a relationship with God and his promise. So, and we know God keeps his promises. Now, God's timeline is not, and I don't think ever has been, our timeline. The society we live in is in such a hurry. We tend to rush God, and human nature says that that's the way Abraham did it too. So we can't fault ourselves for rushing God based on the examples that we have in Scripture, but we can look back with 20/20 hindsight and see that never has, never will work. And so we need to be careful with that. So Abraham's faith in God gave him hope, but it was his hope in God's trustworthiness and his promise. And so he had faith grounded in God, the God of the living, who keeps his promises. He himself is trustworthy, and that's what gave Abraham the significance in this story. Because now we're talking about Abraham's faith as it relates to God. Abraham's faith as it relates to the Jewish nation, but also Abraham's faith as it relates to the Gentile brethren here at Rome. And we'll talk about that. It just became very significant in his letter to the Romans about the aspects of Abraham's faith and how it brought the world to where they are now. So obviously we know that Abraham was the father of faith to the Jewish nation. Now my thinking was when had I been in this audience, and we'll just have, I like to do that, put myself in the audience, how puffed up the Jewish brethren would have been when Paul starts talking about Abraham, and how sullen maybe the Gentile brethren would have been, because that's their guy. That's their guy. That's not our guy. That's their guy. Now he's elevating the Jewish brethren is what first thing that came to my mind, and we'll find that that's not the case at all. It was just his example of story, and he brings a different insight to the Jewish brethren as far as the importance and the significance of Abraham's faith to everyone. And we'll look back. So
he would have a hard time finding a Gentile to show his faith.
Absolutely, and I would dare to say that the Gentile brethren would know something of Abraham. They may not know everything, but they would know something of Abraham. So his faith was an example not only to the Jewish people. His faith stood as an example to all of God's people. And that's where we brought in the Gentiles. So all of God's people. The Old Covenant, New Covenant, it's still a rock-solid example, and it demonstrates how God proclaims his people righteous. And that's the importance that we're focusing on this morning. His faith, Abraham, is our faith as well. It's the same righteousness that we obtain. Our status as Christians, or I don't know if it's status, but our I'm just going to say status. Our status as Christians, our person of Christianity, just our person of Christianity is rooted in all these stories of the Old Testament because that's the history. We're all rooted in our history. We all look to examples from our history. Some we learn from. Some, those mistakes are repeated. We don't learn from our history. But our standing, our relationship, our where we are all revolves around our faith. And so our right standing is born from faith. Abraham believed God, and then he was proclaimed righteous. That's in Genesis and Romans. It was not his works that merited his acceptance, but his trust. And we all know that works are important, but they have no substance without faith. So God justifies by his faith. And the examples that we have help us learn what faith is. It gives us a definition of faith. Okay? It helps us learn how faith works. It helps us learn what faith does. It helps us learn how faith draws us to a right relationship to God, draws us to righteousness. So David, and Paul starts talking about David as another example because to the Gentile nation, Abraham wouldn't have been what would be considered a perfect example of the shift from ungodly to godly. But Paul quotes David. His sin was well known among the Jewish people and those that were versed in the Old Testament. David declares himself blessed because God had forgiven him. He'd forgiven his sin. Forgiveness came as a result of God's gracious response to David's faith or trust, not anything that David did, not his works. His forgiveness came through his faith. So he equates righteousness and forgiveness together. Those who put their trust in God with an active, dynamic, working faith that put their trust in God will be proclaimed righteous, free from the burden of sin. His righteousness was born in faith. So, how do we follow? You know, we see those examples. Sometimes we even understand those examples. But how do we follow those examples? And how were the brethren in Rome, they were expected to follow the examples. The Old Testament is which they had. And the meaning of faith as it worked through the Old Testament testifies to what faith is and how faith functions. That's important. How faith functions in the life of the believer. Okay? Faith is not just something that we get. So faith is not something that we have. Faith is something that we use and grow and nurture and immerse ourselves in. Okay, I like to say, faith is not something that we do. Faith is something that we are. You know, it's just something that's just at the center of our being as it relates to God and His commandments and His will in our lives and our family and how we conduct ourselves in the world that He's given us, and how we show that faith that we have that can't be seen unless we use it. It's just one of those things. Have you ever? And I'm going to relate this to a story that may or may not fit, but have you ever known anybody that had a hidden talent that you had known for a long time and did not have a clue? Not that you just didn't even have a clue, that you were astonished that this person had this particular talent. I had a friend, member of the church, known for years. Our oldest son and their twins were born on the same day. We were willing Melissa and JT out, or no, was it Brandon? It was Brandon, wasn't it? It was Brandon, I'm sorry, our youngest son. I don't know. I was just involved in the pushing. I wasn't involved in the other stuff. So pushing Melissa and Brandon out of the hospital, and here come Mike and his wife coming to have she had twins. And so this is not somebody that I was just acquainted with. This is somebody I spent time with. We had guys' night out at their house. We were friends, okay? And came time they were going to move from their house. And so we all got together. We're going to help them move. And we went up in the upper, like third story of their house in a room. And it's full of guitars and mandolins and all kinds of musical instruments. 50 maybe. And I said, "Hey, Mike, did you inherit them from somebody or something?" He says, "No, I play." I said, "No, you don't." He said, "Yeah, I play." I said, that can't be right." He said, "Yeah, what do you want to hear?" And he pulled out a 12-string guitar. And I said, "No, I don't know." I said, "What do you play?" He said, "Anything you want to hear." I said, that just can't be right. So he started playing. And he was really, really good. And he used to sit in with bands. And, he had this whole other life that I didn't know anything about. Had never mentioned it. And this is years. I've known this guy for years. I was stunned, okay? Our faith should not look like that, okay? That's the opposite of what our faith should look like. People should know that we play a musical instrument. People should know that we have a faith in a God that saves, okay? And so from that moment on, I had a completely different, it wasn't a completely different relationship, but I had a completely different understanding of who Mike was. He was just this other guy. He was, it was astonishing. It was just one of those things that were just astonishing. And he played all the string instruments. Had never had a lesson. He just played. And he just enjoyed it. And he was just a very unassuming guy that was a terrific musician. And it was just astonishing. And so anyhow, I don't know if anybody else has ever had that experience, but that's what I relate our faith to, or the opposite of what I relate our faith to. I don't know how to explain it, but faith functions in the life of a believer. A functional faith is the definition that we're talking about this morning. Faith is given greater significance as we look back to God's people under the Old Covenant. Okay? We can watch the examples grow through the Old Testament of faith in God. We can watch them work. And we get the gift of hindsight because we get to watch their faith fulfilled. And a lot of them didn't get to see that. Okay? Abraham got to see the beginnings of the fruit of his, I'm just going to call it the fruit of his faith. Abraham got to see the beginnings of that because he had a son. Abraham didn't get to see this, the fulfillment of God's promise in that fruit. And so God's people in the Old Testament had a story that we can glean from. A lot of times we not negate, but we kind of overlook the Old Testament as in the significance that it has in our lives today. What does Abraham have to do with John? At the surface level, not a lot. I never met Abraham. I don't know Abraham. I would have to look up the history of Abraham as far as secular history goes. I can glean some from what the scriptures tell me about Abraham. I get to see his mistakes and his fulfillments and God's relationship and those kind of things. But as far as just personally, you don't get to see that effect until you read how significant his life was in where my life is now. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So, God's people under the Old Covenant and that story under the law, we can see that the law helped shape the definition of the covenant. It helped shape the definition of their faith. It helped define who they were and how they acted and how they should have treated one another and God and all of that. We get to see that. And so as Paul is talking to the church at Rome, they get to understand that the law is closely tied with the faith. The faith does not negate the law, okay? And this is where the Gentile brethren come in. The faith does not negate the law, but it just establishes its purpose, its meaning, its reasoning in history. It does not negate the law, but establishes it. It calls for us to give careful consideration on how we deal with the law, the Old Testament, those stories, and not just put it aside. And so that's why we look and see that it's important for us to see that Paul uses the Old Testament in Romans. He uses basically the entire Old Testament because he quotes from the law, he quotes from the prophets, he quotes from the writings. He uses all of that to testify the nature of true faith and righteousness. Because faith stands at the heart of where God's people were in the Old Covenant. It stands at the heart of where God's people are at the New Covenant. And it allows them to see that the things that they do in relationship to what God would have them to do is the product of that faith. those things come about because of their faith in God, not because of God's setting aside of his nation, but because of God setting aside his people of faith. And so, once again, we bring back in the Gentiles. So, Abraham's faith, and this would have been another point where the Gentile brethren were brought in. Abraham's faith was established before circumcision. And so Paul's argument is faith of the circumcision or of the uncircumcision? Because Abraham's faith was counted to him righteousness before the circumcision. He was saved by a faith in God's promises, not from the covenant, not from his actions revolving around or related to the covenant. Faith preceded his circumcision. He was saved by a faith in the promises of God, which he embraced 14 years before he was commanded to be circumcised. His faith rested in the promises of God to give him a child and make him a great nation, which ultimately, and Paul talks about this, resulted in, and this is how we get brought in, the coming of the Son of God and all nations being blessed. Okay? Now, I have a relationship with Abraham based on where I am now. Not the father Abraham that the Jewish nation was, their relationship was, but the father of faith Abraham that brought about the Savior of the world that I have the relationship with. And so Abraham gained his status before God. He became the father of faith for all of us through his faith in God, especially his faith in God's promise. Not the circumcision of his flesh, but the faith in his promise. So our lives of faith should be lived through his example. In the faith in God's promise. And God has promised us. And so our lives of faith, we all have lived our lives at some point by example, either good or bad. We've all followed a bad example, I guess. We've all probably participated in a bad example. We've all been possibly a bad example. And so our lives are based on the things we learn by example from our parents, our close friends, our hobbies, all the things that permeate through our lives have some effect on who we are, how we act, how we become who we, to this point, where we are right now, is all based on everything that's happened before, okay? And that's what Paul is trying to explain, that the people of faith that they are now started long ago. And this is where we ended up. So as we live by example, whether it's good or bad, Abraham's called a friend of God. That would be a good example for us to follow. We should be a friend of God. Abraham was called a keeper of God's commandments. That'd be a pretty good example for us to be in our lives of faith. Abraham was called the recipient of God's promises. Okay? That's who we are. We are the recipient of God's promises. Okay? So, because it was far more than just the promise from God to give Abraham a son. Okay? The promise was to bless Abraham, to bless all nations. And so the promise would benefit all of humanity. So in his story of faith, is connected with our story of faith because we're the recipients of that promise. We're part of all humanity, and we all benefit from the promise. And now, if you look at it just as a promise of a son, that didn't benefit us. But as the blessing to all nations, that came through Christ. And that's where we get our benefit. That's how that connects.
An example of faith. You got to remember, he was 100.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit.
He's the father of nations. And he's 100, and his wife, Sarah, is barren as can be.
Yeah.
Right, you're going to do this.
Yeah.
But he had faith.
He had faith. And I was reading some other material, but we forget that, that promise didn't end with him and Sarah. He married again after that. After Sarah passed, he married again and had more children with his wife. He had more children with his concubines. And he was still over 100. I mean, it didn't end with that it wasn't a one-time deal. Abraham was blessed, and it continued.
Well, you have to understand that if your life expectancy back then was about 140,
Right.
the age of 70 to 100 is like middle age.
That's right.
Hey, John,
Yes.
the real issue with Abraham and his faith was, the problem with the Gentiles and the Jews was, the Jews said that their faith was greater because they had the law and kept the law, because they were circumcised. That made them better than the Gentiles. The Gentiles should follow the example of the Jews. That was the struggle. That's what Paul said. In the previous chapter, he said, what good is your circumcision then?
Right.
And so he's showing here that Abraham was right with God before there was circumcision.
Before the circumcision. That's right.
Before there was a law. Abraham didn't have a law. He
Right.
didn't follow the law that was given to Moses. He lived a long time before that ever happened.
That's right.
And that's what he's trying to show here.
And that's how he's drawing the Gentile brethren in.
Yeah, he's tying them in, saying the Gentiles are every bit as good as you because Abraham was justified by faith before any of this happened.
Right. And he that would have been their greatest, Abraham would have been the Jews' greatest example of why they were Jews. Okay? And Paul points out that before all of that, before Abraham had all the things that make you Jews, he had a faith in the God that was the God of everyone. And that's where we are now. He, like I said when we first started, it felt like Paul was elevating the Jewish brethren at Rome. And as he brought back in the timeline behind what was going on, at what they based their I'm better than you on, it was before that. And so that made God the God of everyone. So That's how we find our story of faith. So we find hope in Abraham's life of purpose. Okay? God acted the way he did with Abraham to bring his children hope, because God, we get to see the I'm going to call it the strength of God to overcome Sarah's barren womb, to overcome Abraham's age, to overcome and bring a child from a place where there was no life to life, which now at the Roman Church we get to see that not only did God bring life from where there was no life, he overcame death through the resurrection of Christ in the ultimate power against the biggest thing that sin has for, or that Satan has for the world, is death without Christ. So Abraham placed his hope in God's power to deliver on his promises, and despite having no children, God credited righteousness to him, not because he was a man of good works, but a man who had a real and living trust and faith in God. He believed in the character and power of God and was willing to act in response to that belief. So faith brought life. And then Paul expands that onto the concept of resurrection. The power of God over death brought his son back to reign as our Lord. Jesus was delivered over to death, to bring forgiveness. He was raised from the dead to bring justification. And his resurrection proved God's power over death. God is the God of the living. You can find that in Matthew and Mark and Luke. And his desire is to bring life to all who choose him. And we have a trust and faith in God's ability to change us from our old dead state and make us into the living, or the image of his living Son. And that's what he does for us. Now the Old Testament is important even to our heritage. And he shows how we are to live. And he shows us the essence of faith. And I think that's the essence of faith. God promised Abraham he'd make him a great nation by his own children, bless those who blessed him, and bless the entire world through him. And we get to see that. His story becomes our story. God proclaimed him righteous because of his faith. His faith became a model for our faith. So through this story of Abraham, we don't only get to see that God was blessing Abraham through all of these things, but we get to see that God is calling us to be and do, through Abraham's example, what God would have us to be and do. And recognize the blessings that come from that as our faith in a powerful and living God. And so that's my challenge for us this morning. That we live a life of faith, not something that we define, but something that God defined for us in the lives of those that is recorded for us in his word. So, look at that. I got done. When I saw I was doing Romans chapter 4, I thought it was just going to be the first half. That was all the whole of Romans chapter 4, and I managed to get through it. even with my guitar story, I actually managed to get through it. Thank you so much for your comments and your attention. And
You do 5 next week?
I'll do next week. I will. Yeah, I'll take one more, and then you're on. Good?